Okay. I will share my presentation. Yeah, tell me when you guys see the screen. Yeah.
Yes, Shirish, we can see the
Oh,
screen.
great. Okay. So what we have done for this this particular class is we are breaking it into three parts. The first part is a small presentation that we have prepared, which is almost like an introduction to what comes in this semester. Yeah. The second part is going to be the reading of the introduction of the book "All That Is Solid Melts into Air" by Marshall Berman. And what I've done for the sake of the students is I have identified very clearly the uh, the the structure of the argument, and I have also sort of I'm going through at least 8 or 10 important paragraphs that are key and which will actually help us later on in the semester as well. The third part is a Q&A session where we hope that you guys are able to ask some questions, difficult ones. It's all right because that's something which we are trying to explore in this semester. Broadly speaking, this semester is going to be called reconfiguring modernity. Yeah. Uh, I'm giving you guys two very clear examples of what modernity can be defined as. The first one is by Michel Foucault, who says that modernity as a historical category is marked by developments such as a questioning or rejection of tradition, the prioritization of individualism, freedom, formal equality, faith in inevitable social, scientific, and technological progress, rationalization and professionalization, a movement from feudal or agrarianism towards capital and market economy, industrialization and secularization, and the development of nation states, representative democracies, and public education. Okay, so this is Foucault's definition of what modernity is, broadly speaking. But in the context of art history, modernity has a limited sense. You will see later on that limited sense is even more limited in case of the way architecture is seen. Okay, so what is that limited sense? So it covers a period between 1860s and 1970s, and the use of the term in this sense is attributed primarily to Charles Baudelaire in his essay Painter of Modern Life, which designated the fleeting ephemeral experience of life in the urban metropolis and the responsibility of art which has to capture that experience. Okay? In this sense, the term refers to a particular relationship to time, one characterized by intense historical discontinuity or rupture, openness to novelty of the future, and heightened sensitivity to what is unique about the present. Okay, so these are broadly the definitions of what modernity stands for. What we did last semester is we created a landscape of modern ideas. Okay, Rohan, correct me if I'm wrong. I can only call it as a landscape of modern ideas, and within which we tried to sort of identify some of the traits. And the red ones are the actual lectures that happened with you guys. We were not able to cover all the other kind of moments in that landscape. There are many others, but we sort of have built this as the landscape of modern. Yeah. Okay, so this semester, yeah, why does modernity need reconfiguring, and what then is slash was the postmodern? Okay, so we are trying to ask these two questions. Postmodernism, broadly speaking, again, is an intellectual stance or mode of discourse defined by an attitude of skepticism towards what is described as the grand narratives and ideologies of modernism. Okay, it's a response against that grand narrative as well as an opposition to epistemic certainty and stability of meaning. Okay, while modernism wanted to consolidate and stabilize the ideas of self, the ideas of state, the ideas of the world. Okay, postmodernism fundamentally argues and challenges those stabilities. Yeah. Uh, this is from a book called Conditions of Postmodernity by David Harvey, where he's quoting some other writer who has identified for us some of the distinctions between the way we understand modernism and the way postmodernism chooses to see things. Okay, and I have outlined five of them, which I think are critical for us as architects and people who are interested primarily in the area of space making to think about. One is this idea of form, which is conjunctive and close in the modern sense, against anti-form, which is disjunctive and open in the postmodern way. The idea of design as something which is controlled and can be executed, as against that something that is set up and established by chance. Okay, also being able to create something. The third is this kind of idea of creation, totalization, and synthesis, which is inherent in any modern kind of idea of space making, against decreation and deconstruction and antithesis. The idea of centering versus the idea of dispersal, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, and the idea of a master code that can then be sort of executed against that, an idiolect kind of an idea where each individual has his own way of actually thinking about language. Okay, so these are fundamental kind of differences in what postmodernism. Okay, whereas in architecture, okay, postmodern architecture is, in my opinion, unfortunately, situated to a certain stylizing of that architecture. Okay, is a style or movement which emerged in the 60s as a reaction against the austerity, the formality, and the lack of variety of modern architecture, particularly in international style, which was advocated by Philip Johnson and Henry Russell Hitchcock. The movement was introduced by architect and urban planner Dennis Scott Brown and architectural theorist Robert Venturi in their book Learning from Las Vegas. Primarily, that book became in many ways the sort of synthesis of the idea of postmodern architecture. Okay, the style flourishes through the 80s and 90s in the works of course, Venturi and Scott Brown, Philip Johnson himself, Charles Moore, Michael Graves, and in the late 90s it is divided into multitude of new tendencies, including high-tech architecture, neo-futurism, deconstructivism, etc. What I've done is I've got some of the kind of examples of postmodern architecture, just as a way to start thinking about what is exactly postmodern. Yeah, so these are Robert Venturi's work, the Guild House. Maybe you have seen this, the Vanna Venturi house. We have all seen. We know that plan. We had built a model of that house last semester as well. Okay, and some of his other buildings. So that's one set. The other two sets are Michael Graves and Charles Moore, both actually working towards a kind of what do you say, a texture and sort of expression of the against this kind of modernist kind of ideals. Yeah. And then, of course, we have Frank Gehry and Philip Johnson himself working towards this kind of idea of deconstruction, etc., etc. Broadly speaking, postmodern tendencies in architecture are categorized in these five kind of ways. One is what is called complexity and contradiction. Okay, so you're able to sort of you're able to put contradictory things together. Okay. Second is the use of color in a certain way. Yeah, these are tendencies, right? The third is the idea of humor, which was felt was lacking in modern architecture. That became a key to actually think about architecture as expressing more than just the what do you say, form follows function, etc., etc. The idea of fragmentation. Yeah, and the third is of course what is called camp, which is this idea that that you play with the rhetoric of humor, and you play with the idea of sort of like, let's do it for fun kind of an idea in many ways. Okay, this is very much detailed in your if you just Wikipedia on postmodern architecture, you will find all these categories in detail, and you will be able to get a sense of what this whole postmodern in architecture. Okay, but there are others who have someone like Charles Jenks, who is actually a landscape architect, who have actually chosen to identify the postmodern within the larger idea of movements in modern. Okay, so here if you see this kind of a timeline from 1900s to 2000, okay, he identifies all the various movements as in many ways ideas of progressing modernism, and he he in the 70s and 80s was very much interested in what the postmodern was, and later on in the 2002 later on he came back to it being a subset of modernism. Okay, so he outlines this kind of a landscape. He uses a framework for analysis which is on the left hand side, which is logical, idealist, self-conscious, intuitive, activist, and unself-conscious environment. Two of them are very kind of modernist kind of tendencies, and the other three are very postmodern kind of tendencies of looking at things. Okay, so he gives us an interesting way to actually categorize the postmodern within a landscape of very clearly an evolution of the modern. There is further critique on the idea of postmodern in the book Conditions of Postmodernity by David Harvey, where he concludes that there is much more continuity than difference between the broad history of modernism and the movement called postmodernism. It seems more sensible to him to see the latter as a kind of crisis within the former, one that emphasizes the fragmentary and the ephemeral and the chaotic side of Baudelaire's formulation, while expressing a deep skepticism as to any particular prescriptions as to how the eternal, immutable should be conceived, represented, or expressed. Okay, but he warns that postmodernist thinking immediately shuts off those other voices from access to more universal sources of power by ghettoizing them within an opaque otherness, the specificity of this or that language game. Okay, primarily he argues that this whole idea of postmodern as emerging from a language game creates that kind of opaqueness. Okay, so this is all right. Ron, I'm going to break this. I just realized that I need to break this. Okay, so we'll go back to the presentation a little later. I'm now going to talk about a little bit about All That Is Solid Melts into Air. So I hope that when you guys are reading, you're also looking up who the writer is and what is the history and things like that. I'll give you a brief introduction. Marshall Berman was a philosopher, an American philosopher based in New York. He was a son of immigrant sort of Jews who left Europe during the war and settled in America. He studied fundamentally philosophy, and he was based at the City College in New York. Okay, so this book is written in 1982, and there are several editions that come out much later. I think the one that I have sent is a little later edition. So Marshall argues that he makes a case for actually reviving the idea of modern, okay, as a very contemporary mode of thinking. Okay, he says that to be modern is to live a life of paradox and contradiction. It is to be overpowered by immense bureaucratic organizations that have power to control and often to destroy all communities, values, lives, and yet to be undeterred in our determination to face these forces, to fight to change the world and make it our own. It is to be both revolutionary and conservative, alive to new possibilities of experiences and adventure, frightened by the nihilistic depths to which so many modern adventures lead, and longing to create and to hold on to something real even when everything melts. We might say that to be fully modern is to be anti-modern. Okay, so he makes an argument which basically is saying is that modernity does not end, but it continues, and we need to thrive for it. Okay, I'm going to quickly escape this, and we are going to do some reading of the book. All That Is Solid Melts into Air, and this is the introduction. It's called Modernity, Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow. Okay, I'm keeping this up here so that you guys can follow as I'm reading parts. Yeah, so it becomes a little easier. You don't have to look anywhere else. Broadly speaking, what he does in the introduction is he categorizes the period of modernity into three parts. Yeah, the first part is 19th century modernism, which is primarily looking at Marx and Nietzsche as two very important kind of proponents. The 20th century modernism, where he is extremely critical of the futurists of Herbert Marcuse's One-Dimensional Man and many others that created that landscape, including the postmodern within it. And then he makes a call for for a third kind of a sort of idea of modernity that looks back at the 19th century modernity and modernism to say that there is something there that we should not miss as we are going ahead. Okay, so I'm going to do some small readings because I hope that is this pace okay with everyone, students? Am I going too fast? Sorry, somebody else.
Yeah, I think you'll have to get the, you continue if they have issues, or we can revisit if they have some questions.
Okay, fine. Okay, so,
because,
but Ron, otherwise the pace is fine. Otherwise the pace
you can,
is fine.
I think they may need a little more time to figure things out, but I think those will happen as you're explaining things.
Okay, so I'm going to confess and that this is going to be a little bit of a roller coaster because we are there is a timeline that comes after this, and I'll show you that timeline also of the contemporary idea of modernity that we are trying to establish. So I'll be showing you that as well. Okay, but it is important to first place what these two distinct ideas of modernity are. Yeah. So I'm going to try and attempt doing that. Okay, so he begins page number 15. There is a mode of vital experience, an experience of space and time, of the self and other, of life's possibilities and perils, that is shared by men and women all over the world today. He calls this as a body of experience modernity. Okay, he says to be modern is to find ourselves in an environment that promises adventure, power, joy, very similar to the preface and the little text that I read. Yeah, modern environments and experiences cut across all boundaries of geography and ethnicity, of class and nationality, of religion and ideology. In this sense, modernity can be said to unite all mankind. Okay, so there is a grand narrative in many ways of creating one unity of sorts. Yeah. Okay, but it is a paradoxical unity, a unity of disunity. It pours us into a maelstrom of perpetual disintegration and renewal, of struggle and contradiction, of ambiguity and anguish. And then he uses the quote, to be modern is to be part of a universe in which, like Marx said, all that is solid melts into air. Okay, first part. So this is just a basic introduction of what he is characterizing very clearly as what is modernity. Okay, let's go to part number 2 that I have highlighted on page number 21. Okay, and this in many ways is the definition or whatever the kind of argument of 19th century modernity. Please look at the sentence, thus the dialectical motion of modernity turns ironically against its prime movers, the bourgeoisie. Okay, he's also making a critique of that modernity, but it may not stop turning there. After all modern movements are caught up in this ambience, including Marx's own. Yeah? Suppose, as Marx supposes, that bourgeois forms decompose and that a communist movement surges into power. What is to keep this new social form of sharing, from sharing its predecessor's faith and melting down in the modern era? Okay. Marx understood this question and suggested some answers, which he explores later on, blah, blah, blah. I will continue a little further. He uses a word on the next page, which is page number 22, where he says, a world where everything is pregnant with its contrary, as the defining kind of moment of what is the idea of modern in the 19th century. You guys can after this presentation, you guys can go back and revisit the text. It's very interesting to read the text. Okay, now he comes back to again some of the sort of writers and thinkers from the 20th century. Okay, so that was 19th century. This is 20th century. Just hold on, page number 24. Okay, second paragraph. If we listen closely to 20th century writers and thinkers about modernity and compare them to those of a century ago, we will find a radical flattening of perspective and shrinkage of imaginative range. Our 19th century thinkers were simultaneously enthusiasts and enemies of modern life, yeah, wrestling inexhaustibly with its ambiguities and contradictions. Their self-ironies and inner tensions were a primary source of their creative power. Their 20th century successors have lurched far more towards rigid polarities and flat totalizations. Yeah. Modernity is either embraced with a blind and uncritical enthusiasm, or else condemned with a neo-Olympian remoteness and contempt. In either case, it is conceived as a closed monolith, incapable of being shaped or changed by modern men. Open visions of modern life have been supplanted by closed ones, both and by either or. Okay, so this he says is the problem of the 20th century moderns. Very clear. Okay, that there is a there is either you're condemning it or you are embracing it without really looking at what is the other side of it. Okay, sorry, I'll continue to the next page, and he then highlights some of these tendencies. Okay, page number 26 is where he talks about the futurists in particular as the first kind of uh, culprits, if I may say, in this game of his. He says the futurists carried the celebration of modern technology to a grotesque and self-destructive extreme, which ensured that their extravagances would never be repeated. But their uncritical romance of machine fused with their utter remoteness from people would be reincarnated in modes that would be less bizarre and longer lived. We find this mode of modernism after World War I in the refined forms of the machine aesthetic. The technocratic pastorals of Bauhaus, Gropius, Mies van der Rohe, Le Corbusier, Leger, etc., etc. We find it again in another world war. He says that it continues in that Second World War, this machine kind of extension. In the spaced out, high-tech rhapsodies of Buckminster Fuller, Marshall McLuhan, in the Alvin Toffler future shot. Okay, and then he gives a quote on Marshall McLuhan's understanding media. The entire introduction is filled with references, many of which we are going to see in the coming future also. Okay, and then if you go to page number 27, he continues with the problem. The first paragraph itself, he says, but its problem and the problem of all modernisms in the futurist tradition is that with brilliant machines and mechanical systems playing all the leading roles, just as the factory is the subject in the quotation above, there is precious little for modern man to do except to plug in. Okay, so what has happened is that with this kind of an extension of the idea of the modern and the transformation of life, of material, of the entire machine taking over, there's precious little for us to do as modern men and women, but to just plug in. And that's the idea of modernity, which is primarily and fundamentally in the 20th century, 20th century condition. Okay, he further on goes to highlight some of the other tensions in this period, which is primarily in the 1960s, where he says, go to page number 29. If you go to page number 29, and in the second chapter, okay, he says the volatile atmosphere of the 1960s generated a large and vital body of thought and controversy over the ultimate meaning of modernity. Yeah. Much of the most interesting of this thought revolved around the nature of modernism. Yeah. Modernism in the 1960s can be, he then divides the modernism of 1960s into three parts. Yeah. Basic attitudes towards modern life as a whole, three parts: affirmative, negative, and the withdrawn. Okay, as these three fundamental attitudes to modernity. I'm going to pick on the affirmative, which is on page number 31. Last paragraph, he says the affirmative vision of modernism was developed in the 60s by a heterogeneous group of writers, including John Cage, Lawrence Alloway, Marshall McLuhan, Susan Sontag, Robert Venturi, etc., etc. It coincided loosely with the emergence of pop art in the early 1960s. Its dominant themes were that we must wake up to the very life we are living, yeah, and cross the border, close the gap. This meant, for one thing, breaking down barriers between art and other human activities, such as commercial entertainment, industrial technology, fashion, design, politics. It also encouraged writers, painters, dancers, composers, and filmmakers to break down the boundaries of their specialization and work together on mixed media productions and performances that would create richer and more multivalent arts. And if Ron, you know that cinema changed radically after the 60s, and it saw a very different idea of the movie, the camera, and gaze, everything shifts after the 60s. So this he makes it as one of the important turning points. I'm continuing in the next paragraph. For most modernists of this variety, who sometimes call themselves postmodernists, modernism of pure form and modernism of pure revolt were both too narrow, too self-righteous, and too constricting to the modern spirit. Their ideal was to open oneself to immense variety of richness of things and materials and ideas that the modern world inexhaustibly brought forth. Okay, they breathed fresh air and playfulness into cultural ambience, which in the 50s had become unbearable. Yeah, so that is what that reaction was in the 60s. Okay, now where am I? Okay, please focus on page number 33. Uh, Virtually, first paragraph. Virtually no one today seems to want to make the large human connection that the idea of modernity entails. Now he's talking about today, which means in the 80s. Sorry, it's not today, it's in the 80s. The book is written in the 80s. Yeah. Hence, discourse and controversy over the meaning of modernity, so lively a decade ago, have virtually ceased to exist today, he says. Okay, many artistic and literary intellectuals have immersed themselves in a world of structuralism, a world that simply wipes out questions of modernity along with all other questions about the self and history of the map. Okay. Others have embraced mystique of postmodernism, which strives to cultivate ignorance of modern history and culture and speaks as if all human feeling, expressiveness, play, sexuality, community have only just been invented by the postmodernists and were unknown to the inconceivable, even inconceivable before last week. Okay, so he's talking about the condition in the 80s of theorists actually. Okay, he goes on in the last part to make Foucault as a very important figure in warning us about this condition and its extremes. Okay, where he says that Foucault reserves his most savage contempt for people who imagine that it is possible for modern mankind to be free, etc., etc. You can read that. Okay, but the last part I'm going to read entire on page number 35. Okay, second paragraph, where he gives his idea of what could be the new modern. He says, in this bleak context, I want to bring the dynamic and dialectical modernism of 19th century to life again. A great modernist, he quotes a modernist poet. Okay, I'm going a little faster. Blah 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 blah. They can read this. Okay, the argument of his book is that, in fact, the modernisms of the past can give us back a sense of our own modern roots that go back 200 years. Okay, they can help us connect with our lives, with the lives of millions of people who are living through the trauma of modernization thousands of miles away in societies radically different from our own. Okay, so he is making he's making a claim saying that they are also modern and living that trauma. Okay, and it is we need to acknowledge these societies that might be radically different from ours. Okay, uh, similar to what some of the arguments that the postmodernists were making, but he is actually saying, he's actually not just referring to it only on the surface. I feel this is my reading. Okay, he says they can illuminate the contradictory forces and needs that inspire and torment us. Our desire to be rooted in a stable and coherent personal and social past, and our insatiable desire for growth, not merely for economic growth, but for growth in experience, in pleasure, in knowledge, in sensibility, and in growth that destroys both the physical and social landscape of our past and our emotional links with those lost worlds, our desperate allegiances to ethnic, national, class, and sexual groups, which we hope will give us a firm identity, and the internationalization of everyday life, of our clothes, household goods, books, music, our ideas and fantasies that spread all our identities all over the map. Our desire for clear, solid values to live by, and our desire to embrace the limitless possibilities of modern life and experience that obliterate all values, the social and political forces that propel us into explosive conflicts with other people and other peoples, even as we develop a deeper sensitivity and empathy towards our ardent enemies and come to realize sometimes too late that they are not so different from us. Okay, I will stop there. Okay, so he makes a call for, in many ways, what I think is to reconfigure modernity. Okay, I'll go back to the presentation now. I hope this was not very tormenting, but okay. So, what is this reconfiguring modernity? What is it about? We have had several discussions. We used to do a framework which was loosely similar to this, but we never conceptualized it, Rohan, like as calling it reconfiguring modernity. This is the first time that we are doing it, and we are going to look at some of the sort of ideas and modes through which this modernity can be reconfigured. Here is this kind of constellation. Uh, there are words like apocalypse, meaning, history, dream, memory, context, vernacular, everyday, power, syntax, subaltern, gender, commodity, and rhizome as these kind of ideas for reconfiguring modernity. This is going to be this semester largely. Okay, I'll take a 1 minute break before I come to this. Sorry, I'll just have some water.
Yeah. No, I think it's important to kind of think what I think what's nice, Shirish, about Marshall Berman's introduction, which I do recommend that all of you really read. I know it's difficult sometimes to read, but it's something that I think will help you kind of understand just the I guess the I don't know how we can put it, the violence भी नहीं बोल सकते, but the sort of
Tension.
tensions, I guess, the tensions of being modern. कि हमारा modern क्या है, part tradition, part new, part old, everything seems to be flying apart. Everything seems to be kind of like, how are we holding it together? How are we trying to find meaning within this? I think Marshall Berman in his essay tries to lay out some of the ways in which we try and do that. So I would recommend that you also, besides of course Shirish's kind of introduction, I would also ask you all to sit and read the actual essay. It's not that difficult to read if you start getting into it. And even if it is difficult, let me put it bluntly, even if it is difficult, it is work. You are supposed to work at reading it. If you want access to knowledge, my dear darlings, you can't afford to be lazy with reading. It is work. It's practice and it's work. I recommend that you work at it. And if you need help, we are there. Questions that you have concerning sentences, questions that you have concerning ideas, please feel free to raise them. We will be more than willing to take time off from whatever we are doing to try and answer those questions. Okay? Shirish,
Right.
back.
So what we are doing in this semester particularly is we are actually okay. Let me first outline the kind of period of modernity, which is the second period, the 20th century modernity, and the new kind of period that we are going to look at. Okay, so first of all, here is a timeline from 1900 loosely to 2020. Okay, and what we have done is we have identified the kind of large kind of periods of so to say socio-political kind of changes. Okay, within which we are going to try and identify some of the readings and writings and films and things that art that we see. Okay, so the first period is a period between 1900 and 20s, and some of these periods we have already gone through, and we might not do that in this semester. We are more interested in the later period. I'll come to that later. Okay, so first is a period of before the end of First World War. So that's those 20 years. The second period is a very important period, which is a period between the wars. Okay, and you will find many writers and theoreticians actually talking about that period as a period between the wars. Okay, third period is from 1945 to 1970, which is actually marked by decolonization and the Cold War fundamentally, and it is also the rise of many social and political struggles and a very strong counterculture movement. Okay, which happens primarily in the West, but there are kind of counterculture movements here as well in our part of the world. The fourth period is from 1970 to 2000, which is a period of resistances and new ideas and a period of liberalization of economies. Okay, so that's the fourth period. Okay, which Rohan, I have chosen to end it at the word.
Yeah.
Okay, very clearly, because the World Trade Center and the fact that we actually witnessed that on television, on mass media like that, changed our world completely. I don't know
Yeah.
whether you guys remember watching it on TV, but it was a moment of strategic
I
change.
I
Yeah.
think that's a good this because I think even the smartphone
Yeah.
emerges in 2004,
Yeah, and
2005.
then yeah, exactly. And then the last 2 decades, I call it a period of mediated life, where everything that we do is actually through another medium, and the rise of social media, rise of WhatsApp, Twitter, and now Instagram, where the word or the written word is losing more and more of its meaning, and that is evident in the fact of the conversation that we had just a few minutes ago with all the students. So broadly speaking, these are the kind of breakups of the timeline. Uh, in terms of reconfiguring modernity, some of the important events. Okay, of course, one of the important events is the idea of the formation of United Nations. The fact that the world was engaged in a war together with everything getting shifted, okay, is very very important. If you see this timeline, this is under construction, okay, but if you see a period between the 60s and the 70s, you find a lot of sort of resistances coming up. You have the Paris riot, you have the Stonewall riots, you have the rise of Naxal and Maoist movements across the world, not just in India. Okay. At the same time, you also have a lot of sort of other kind of movements to look forward to. The entire cultural kind of movement is one. Woodstock, landing on the moon. So technologically, you are now advancing to another stage. Okay, 70s onwards, we see another kind of resistance and the formation of new identities, and it is also a period where several civil wars actually break up. Okay, this timeline, Ron, I've stopped it at 1990 because we are still building. Yeah, of the Gulf War. Yeah, of the, meaning the Indian liberalization is something that we'll take up. Take up
when we get to it.
later. Okay. There is, although within this timeline also, there is you will find that the center gets destabilized. Yeah, what used to be the center in the kind of colonial kind of period gets destabilized. One of the things that happens after the First World War is that new nations are actually carved out of existing larger empires in Europe. Okay, so here's an interesting map. You can see the Ottoman Empire breaks into Syria, Lebanon, Turkey, and Iraq. You can see the entire Austro-Hungarian Empire that breaks into Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, parts of Romania, Yugoslavia, and so on and so forth. And you can see that the German Empire also disintegrates with the formation of many other nations that come up during this time. So this is first kind of destabilization of the breaking up of empire at home post First World War. Okay, here's a map of the world showing the colonies that the center, which is over here in Europe, that commanded. Okay, this was the world what it looked like in the 1940s. Okay, sorry, by 1970s, all of these nations have actually gained independence, and there are some nations that get independence later in the 80s also, but very few. Most of the nations in that period have actually become independent. Okay, and post First World War, post Second World War, a new order which got established, which was this kind of two kind of sort of powers, the Soviet Russia and America. Uh, this is called the Iron Curtain during the Cold War, which was divided, which meant that either you were inclined as a socio-political economy towards the West, or what you see the capitalist economy, or you were towards the kind of socialist kind of an order in the world. And then simultaneously, if you see the year 1956 is the first time that there is a non-aligned movement that takes form, where 120 nations actually come together and say that we are not aligned with either one of them. And this actually, most of these nations are newly formed nations in the world. So there is a shifting of the center and a stake of power by smaller nations on their authority to sort of have a political economy which was of a different time. Okay, sorry. Uh, this in many ways, I have forgotten actually what the dark blue uh, and the light blue is. I can't remember why I used the map. But what I was trying to sort of show over here is that the new equator, which is formed in this new world order, is not at the center over here, but it is actually the political equator is now shifted, where everything below this line is considered the south, okay, and everything below above this line is considered the north. And this is used a lot in theories and in papers later on. There is, of course, yeah, sorry, in post-colonial theory actually,
Yeah,
right?
it's called the Global South.
The global south, it's called, yeah.
Global South.
This is a very interesting map created by an architect named Teddy Cruz, who argues that although the equator lies over here, okay, there is such a thing called a functioning core and a non-integrating gap, okay, and he claims that it is within that non-integrating gap that we are actually continuing to exploit resources and labor from, okay, while we develop the functioning core. So we'll talk about that a little later. I thought this was an interesting kind of idea of destabilizing the center. Okay, I will end this presentation on this slide, which is what our course is going to. Sorry, I'm going back.
Yeah.
Let me see. And we open for a conversation. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think what Shirish has kind of laid out is the general landscape of
Yeah.
the sort of world that we'll be entering, because we are looking really at the 50 years of the 20th century, or rather the years since 1945 up till maybe even 2020,
Up to 2020
and
maybe. Yeah.
up to 2020. And thinking about some of the concerns that we have had as architects, as citizens actually of this planet, that have really kind of been exaggerated because of technologies and because of war and because of politics and because of these incredible changes that the world went through at that time. Berman in his essay puts that down in the way that the person's idea of who they were, how relationships changed with nature, with all of those things. And it's in that world really that architecture itself tries to find some sort of meaning. And architects try and make sense of the world and try and decide, abhi hum karenge kya? What is it that we should be, how should we participate in the making of better worlds, given the fact that this is what the world is today. It's gone through atomic bombs and it's gone through mass migrations. Technologies are changing. People have reached the moon. Yeah, everything that people took for granted until 1945 has been thrown out of the window. Uh, there are no colonies suddenly, in like periods of in a short period of 10 years, 200-year-old colonies were completely dissolved. They just disappeared overnight. So there was a new world order that emerges. Now in that new world order, we have, like, India is also coming to terms with that, at that time. Like, we are also getting independence. We are like, acha, who are we? How do we put our new nation together? So those are questions really that we'll be talking across this entire semester. And I think Shirish is in his diagram of that circle around which we have all these questions concerning history, vernacular, all these words that we take so often for granted. Na, ye vernacular architecture hai, ye hamara history hai. But we never really investigate कि ये vernacular होता क्या है exactly.
And also where does it come from, this idea of vernacular? Yeah. What are the roots of definition of this vernacular?
So we are hoping that in that in this we've chosen this particular format for the lectures because we really want you to be involved with talking about it. We want this to be more a conversation class. So which is why I think we're trying a new structure out for the course itself. Shirish, you want to kind of explain what that's?
So what we were thinking is that we will maybe break you guys in groups of 8, okay, and you guys will remain as one group throughout this course, okay. So whenever any readings are given, whenever any work of art is to be seen or a film has to be watched, or a text has to be analyzed or something like that, you guys can actually come together as a group and do it and raise certain questions from those readings. Okay, and that can become in many ways your individual kind of discussion group that actually allows you also to sort of come to terms with, like, not everybody might be comfortable reading, but you might be comfortable actually having a discussion with your friends about certain things that are spoken, or sharing certain kinds of ideas. So we want you guys to have some time to do that, and then come to class over here and have a conversation with us as these groups. So if we break you guys in groups of 8, I think there will be Ron, I think there'll be 10 groups.
Yeah.
Essentially there'll be 10 groups. Yeah. So then what we can do is that, say for example, if we are doing a class next time, we might be looking at the apocalypse next time. So we'll send you guys something to see or read, and then one or two of those or three of those groups can actually come here as a group and give us some of the questions that came in your discussion. Okay, and we will try and create a system by which you guys get some points for it or something. I can't give you chocolates for it, but I'll give you points for it.
Can give marks.
We'll give marks for it.
We'll give
Okay.
marks.
So what happens is that you are not, because we saw some of the blogs, and the blogs are actually in many ways, some of you have written them very well. I must say that you guys are serious about expression and expression through written text, while some others are just not interested, it seems, in that mode of
So
expression.
some of them
right?
have made the blog. I haven't even written anything,
Yeah.
which is just like amusing. What are we supposed to do? Like admire the formatting?
So so it's okay, but we are saying that at least when we are in this class, you can engage us a little bit. Okay, here's another way of putting it. Okay, we will give you marks for how you tickle us in this
Yes.
class.
Good
Okay.
idea. Yeah.
Meaning, if for example, two, three of your groups are able to tickle us and raise our eyebrows, that's a mark of point right there. Okay.
Yeah.
What do you think? We are thinking of it like that. What do you guys think? I want to open this out to your class right now.
Let's get some responses from them, na, so far. What do I mean?
Respond on anything.
Man.
This response gets you 2 marks. Right.
I have a doubt actually.
Yeah.
Sure.
From the presentation. So I think I got a little lost in the middle when the critique of postmodernism was brought in, where it was like it was talking about something that shuts off people's voices and ghettoizes. I mean, I always assumed that postmodernism was this kind of reaction to brutalism, wherein you had this kind of architecture that could solve problems or thought it could solve problems, and then you have postmodernism that kind of comes in and says you can't, but you can have fun doing it. So I didn't really understand
Yeah.
like where that critique came
Yeah.
from.
Nishanti, we have to acknowledge that postmodern architecture, okay, as something which is distinct from postmodernism. Okay, we need to understand that postmodern architecture is in many ways a reaction, like you said, to the architectural style and kind of narrow, brutalist kind of constrained kind of ideas that emerge from modern architecture. Okay, postmodernism as a broader kind of a concept took on much more than just that little aspect, I think. Don, sorry.
Yeah. I think the word postmodern is one of those words that takes on a different meaning depending on who you're talking to, actually.
Yeah.
There are many different tendencies. One of the fundamental things about the postmodern is that it was a critique of everything that happened earlier, to put it bluntly. And some of the critiques were highly technological. Some of them were anti-technological. Some of them were about humor. Some of them was about anger. There were many. Some emerged from feminist ideas. Some emerged from kind of queer ideas. Some emerged from merely looking at form for form's sake itself. So I
And
think the
art for
nature
art's
of
sake.
those critiques
Yeah.
was very, very varied. Many people many people felt at that time, I think, that what the modern project had done is that the modern project was actually, I think, very unfairly blamed for a lot of the violences that happened uh, of the war. Okay. And I think that was a simplistic kind of collision. and a very problematic one, because the modern project in the 20s and the 30s really was about freedom and was about many other things. But somehow in the post-war time, it was imagined that that particular emphasis on rationality and freedom and universalism was tending to was in some ways very violent, okay, or impure, or something that was dangerous. So there was a big tendency, I think around the 50s and the 60s especially, that really started thinking कि ये सब पुराना modernism जो है उसको we'll have to rethink. In fact, like you were saying about the brutalists, right? The brutalists are also actually a reaction against modernism in a strange way. Hmm? If you look at what the Siam Charter of the brutalists come together in 1954, I think, in one of the last Siam conferences. Siam, of course, being the conference where all Europe, I think last semester we looked at Corbusier, right? And we looked at the Siam Charter and things like that. At that time is when Peter and Alison Smithson and Giancarlo De Carlo and all of these guys come together. And actually, they are the brutalists. In many ways, their project is also an anti-modern project. No? So would you call that postmodern? And those are also the questions that can be raised. So rather than think of the postmodern as a unified style, which it never was, okay, one can think about the postmodern as how Shirish has put it. It's a critique of the modern. The critique comes in many different ways. Everyone has different problems with everything, right? So people have different problems with the modern. So each of them, what we'll be doing is that we'll be looking at history. Like some people thought that the modern project was disrespectful to history. So you had people who tried to articulate what was the importance of history. You had people who felt that the modern project was an incomplete project. It didn't take the technology completely forward. It could have just embraced technology much more wholeheartedly. And we'll be looking at people like um, Buckminster Fuller and Archie Graham and people like that, who really embraced the idea of the machine in a much more stronger way than they felt even the modernists had done. You have people who are coming from the colonies, like us, who think that the modern project is at one level liberatory, but it also in many ways is an erasing of our own identity. So the questions of identity become an important question for the postmodern that they follow. The languages of architecture that each of these and all of these around that circle come up with are very, very different from each other. Okay, there's certain tendencies that we might be able to kind of echo, but actually, in terms of their interests, they're very, very different. So you have feminists, and the 60s, of course, sees the rise of things like women's rights, gay rights. In India, it becomes the point where the Naxalite movement starts, where the tribals are kind of coming together against the upper classes and the castes. So you have that entire turmoil of that period, that is about pluralities, but not pluralities in a sense that anything goes. Every single one of these new positions is also in conflict with one another. So you have, for example, and right now I think we are seeing the 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 kind of, let's say, the height of identity politics, right? Where you're constantly being berated for being upper caste, upper class, feminist, man, masculine, cisgender, that heteronormative. That's the way that entire thing has happened, and I think that entire discourse is a result of the critique on the modern and the imagination that there's such a universal. And I think so. These are very important critiques. So it's this journey that we'll be tracing from the time of the critique of the modern, from that moment of the 50s and 60s, to the time that we are inhabiting now, where identity politics, including nationalist identity politics, has become the way in which we define who we are and we define what value systems are.
Actually, Nishanti, it's interesting. If you think about it, and if you look at the history of history of modernism, you will find that our entire democratic ideal is situated within that modern project. Okay, it is our entire nationalist movements are actually coming out of that modern project. Okay, so on one hand, we are born out of that. The nations are born out of that. Okay, and on the other hand, in today's context, you recently must have heard that someone said that there is too much democracy. Okay, and what is happening in America right now? Exactly, a kind of a sort of a kind of a strange kind of totalitarian kind of response to everything that is modern being sidelined as bad, okay, or as wrong, and wanting to take control. So it's an interesting kind of a period right now to think about where is where is the modern, what is modern, and what is the idea of modernity today. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Please read the introduction. I'll try and find the other book also, Conditions of Postmodernity, which is by David Harvey. His argument is very different. He's not making an argument. He's making an argument for actually political economy being primary force in uh, moving us forward. Okay, so his concern is about uh, how power gets structured through industrialization, post-industrialization, etc., etc. You know, Marshall Berman himself is in many ways. Berman is also a romantic. You know what I'm saying, that uh, he likes to. For example, I remember attending a attending a lecture where David Harvey said something like, "There's too much of pacification with cappuccino," and Marshall Berman came up next to the dais and asked him, "What's wrong with cappuccino? I enjoy it. It is for him. Cappuccino is something that he wants to what is called bathe in that luxury, okay, of modern life. That he feels he's privileged to do that, and he wants to do that as a modern man. Okay, so there is that also. Yeah, I'll try and find that text. I can't find it online. The book.
Mm.
Okay, thank you. Also, I was hoping we could maybe have a discussion about the on the timeline, the last portion that you mentioned, which was like the media age. I mean, I understand that, like, you know, the written word is kind of losing hold, but I mean, I would kind of argue that it's because it's sort of being transferred to many other different media. Like, I think that the information still exists out there. And I mean, so I remember for last sem, I was kind of doing research on Foucault, and I found a lot of students themselves that were passionate about it, that would make like 1 to 2 hour long videos on YouTube, where they would kind of put up that. I mean, I don't know. I kind of think that um, it would be more towards like the information age, or classified that way, rather than. I mean, I think that information is still there, and
No, I think you may, you may be right. Maybe we are being kind of, because we belong to a generation, like, I'm born in 1971, which belongs to a completely different sort of time zone. And but I must say that, and as I'm kind of caught in lockdown, I'm constructing most of my lectures with information that I find online. But I still find the source of that information that is still text. I agree with you. There's a lot of great information there on YouTube, but those are interpretations of the text by an individual. Now, I don't know whether those interpretations necessarily are great sort of interpretations per se. They are useful interpretations, but tomorrow you could kind of go up online and do an interpretation of it, and I guess that's also fine. Um, but I do think still, even today, that most of the more, I guess, reliable material continues to be in the form of text. Maybe there will be a time, Nishanti, and you're absolutely right. Maybe we are on the cusp of that right now, where we are moving into a post-textual world, where words will no longer be or the reading or writing won't be really the primary method through which knowledge is dissipated. But I'm still like I mean I go for I do a lot of I look at a lot of YouTube, especially concerning, let's say, architecture, for example. To construct courses, I go online and I see some courses and things like that, look at material that's there. But finally, when it comes to me making my own making my lecture, uh, I don't know whether I'm able to kind of get as much online yet. That's not to say it won't happen. I'm sure it'll happen sometime in the future. Mhm. But whether the
Uh,
written word is going to be replaced, I don't know. Actually, one thing,
I,
another thing I was saying, I actually think people are reading much more because of the internet.
Yeah,
If I
Rohan,
look
but
at
the
it,
problem is, Rohan, but the I mean, there are several kind of theories around it. Yeah, you're reading much more, but the question is, what is it that you're reading? And this question of I mean, post-truth, right? This new term that has emerged. post-truth and this whole emergence of things like news laundry and those who actually verify whether that information is actually true or not. Because of the way the information is presented to you, there is a lot of ambiguity in that information, and you require another kind of a set of community people slash whoever who come in as a mediated kind of a
maybe Shirish, the other thing I was thinking, I mean, back to Nishanti's point, that maybe I belong to a generation where there was this idea of the specialist as somebody who's trained in something, and that training and reading, etc., is the one that creates the knowledge base. But if I think about Wikipedia right now, Wikipedia trusts in the crowd. It trusts the crowd in many ways to make the sensible decisions. Which is another mode of thinking about what is right and what is wrong. I mean, I use Wikipedia all the time, so I'm not one to complain. But I also know for a fact that Wikipedia is so easily edited by anybody with an agenda. Like you see that all the time when a particular kind of, say, politician or a film star is unpopular, somebody goes and kind of edits their Wikipedia page to make it. You see this all the time. So I am still not completely trusting of the collective space yet. Maybe that's my point.
Yeah.
Right, I get that.
So I would still say read. I mean, you know what I mean? Or actually, even if you don't read, at least go to YouTube and watch things that are not cat videos. So, although I like cat videos too.
Yeah. You like cake videos?
What? Cake?
Yeah, this.
No. Cooking videos make me ill, Papa. I can't watch. I'm like, why are people watching this? Anyway, anyone else wants to kind of ask something? Is there something in particular that you like to do?
Yeah, is this exciting?
Yeah. You know what we used to do? I don't know whether we can do that now. Is that we used to have a film for every lecture. We used to have a film slot. We used to show a film and have a conversation about that too. I don't think we can do that now, because of the internet.
We'll have to give them the film and they can watch it in their space and then come back and have a conversation.
कहाँ से यार download करे, upload करो, download करो यार.
Okay. I don't know. I'm not getting any responses other than Nishanti. So
you didn't pick your people for responses. See, this is the.
Okay.
You should have picked.
Right. I'm picking
Unless
now.
you pick, it doesn't happen.
Ishan, I want to talk to Ishan today because he has shared the link for the Ishan Desai.
Oh, Desai, cool.
Ishan, hi.
Yeah, two Ishan.
Hi.
Are there things in particular that you'd like us to cover in this semester? Because that's what the semester is. It's a place for conversation. So.
I can't really think of anything on the spot right now.
Cool. If you do, let us know.
Did you get a chance to read the introduction?
Yeah, I read 3-4 pages.
Okay.
What did you think about it?
It seemed interesting. So I actually read some part of conditional postmodernity. That's why I had the PDF of it. And so actually, me and my friend I had also recently participated in a competition, a writing architecture competition, which was about traditionality or traditionality or modernity, which to pursue and which to give up on. So so like this book was one of the main leads that we found, and like I don't know what exactly to talk about, but like the sort of conclusion that we came up to was like, in the case of India, maybe traditions are to be foregone because of the inherent problems that we see in things like the caste system, which are not only social systems but also in some sense economical systems too. So when we think of those kind of traditions to be pursued or not, maybe it's better to let go of them and maybe adopt the idea of modernism. I can share that essay after in
That'd
some
be
time.
good.
That'll be very nice.
You should share it with the class, and maybe you can have a discussion around that. That also might be interesting.
Yeah. I'll share it.
Yeah. That'll be great.
Very interesting. So what is this competition actually? It's like every year competition, is it, on writing?
I don't know. It actually came on our class WhatsApp group. It was the IDHA Labs.
Yeah, it was doing the rounds, I think. I had some third year students also have conversations with me about what they were trying to do. It's a kind of complicated thing, this idea of tradition and modernity. I've always felt that that tradition was invented by modernity.
Yeah, yeah.
It didn't exist before that. It was just natural. It was the modern movement that suddenly said, "Oh, ये अपन का tradition भी होता है." You know what I mean? It's like a thing. It's a very common sort of trope that people use: tradition versus modernity. Yeah, interesting question.
Also, one more thing, like I was thinking about a while ago, like would it be, would we call our college a postmodern, a college that delves more into the postmodern philosophies, or delve more into the modern philosophy? So I have a friend who studies in LS Reg, and I was like listening a bit in at the start when you guys were talking about it. So like whenever we discuss our projects, like my projects are usually this, they start off with like adjectives and terms, and their project starts with structural systems and things like those. So in one of the lists that they shared, where there was a comparison between modernism, postmodernism, where modernism seemed to be more logical and more like non perspective, but postmodernism seemed to be like more individualistic. So like
No,
is like our college curriculum tuned towards postmodernism, or
it's
just
a
I
good.
just had a question a while ago.
Who was
Yeah.
this? Who asked this question?
Uh, Ishan.
I did. Yeah, Ishan, you only asked. Good question.
Yeah.
Ishan,
Yeah,
can we see your face when we are having this
yeah.
conversation?
Nice to see your face because it's like it's a good
Thanks.
question, Ishan. Hi, Ishan. Oh my God, so nice to see your face. It's scary not seeing faces. Huh? Like talking to Anishan. Um, it's a very good question because it's something that we always struggle with. Trying to understand first what is the modern and what is the postmodern. Huh? First of all, and both these terms have been much misunderstood. The idea that the modern is interested in the rational only is itself, first of all, not true. Okay, because if I look at the Surrealists or look at Dada as two art movements that were in the 1920s, for God's sake. Hmm? Or even if I look at Corbusier's work with his art and his sort of play with form that very often was part of his painting projects as well as his architectural projects. There is like irrational stuff all over the place, man. It's not like everything is not like form follows function as far as Corbusier is concerned. So so this idea of freedom, very much part of the modern project. Like we believe that we should be free. That is the modern project. Uh, and and that is something that we as a school continue to believe it. We believe in freedom. It's an important thing. So are we modern or postmodern? Now the problem, what happened is that very project of freedom, let us say, I'm just so using freedom, there are many others: justice, equality, love, all of these also part of the modern. What happened is in the postmodern, it was seen that what happened is that in spite of all the ambitions that the modernists had, that they are bringing freedom to people, okay, in many of the acts that they performed in the world, they were actually destroying it. Understand? That's what happened actually. It was like, holy shit, you wanted to do this, but man, you totally failed. Okay. That was the big critique of the modern. Okay. So when you're asking me that question, right? When I say when are we modern or postmodern? It's a good question, but I wouldn't know how to tell you that because I believe that. I think as a school, we believe that there are certain value systems in the world uh, that we as people need to hold on to. I'm not even talking about as architects. That we believe as a people that people should be free. We should love each other. We should understand each other. Give each other some rope. Like itna judge nahi karo logo ko. That kind of like just a place where we can just be together as a community of people living in the world in touch with nature. All of these things. That's what I believe in. I think that most of us should believe in. And what?
Rohan, the surrealists were not told that they are postmodern. That term didn't exist.
Oh, it didn't
So,
exist,
so
right?
now that they are gone, okay, you don't need to call them postmodern. You know what
Yeah.
I'm
So
saying?
they were never postmodern,
No,
but
no, I know that. I know that
this,
they were
yeah,
never.
yeah,
They were never, and
yeah.
I don't. I
Yeah,
think that the postmodern is also very the entire idea that you are postmodern is a modern idea.
yeah.
That it can be postmodern is a modern idea. It's within modernity, right?
Yeah.
So
So So I think it's useful, Ishan, to kind of, instead of using modernity, to use modernism. Because what happened, ism is very much a style. It happens at a very particular kind of, a particular architectural language that is part of an ism. Hmm? So there's a postmodernist style, that is fine. You use iconography and stuff like that and shit like that. You can do. But so it's useful to kind of to use the various words in different ways, like modern, modernity, and modernism, to use them carefully. So I think as a school, we believe in the project of modernity. Okay. And I think that not just my school, architecture as a general discipline overall, if you ask its value systems as a discipline, it will say that it believes in the modern, it believes in modernity. Okay. Now there are many roads towards that people construct towards that idea of the modern. Some of them are more effective than others. Some of them are more old-fashioned than others. Some of them are still caught up with older models. Okay. Uh, so in that sense, what we are trying to do within the school is challenge many of these older models, because we believe that they were not able to really talk about freedom. So many of our approaches have challenged preconceived structures of teaching architecture. Okay. So that in that sense, to some extent, you could say that I don't even want to call it postmodern, because it's a misjudging of the term, because it would mean that I don't believe in some of the ideas that the surrealists had concerning freedom.
Rohan, we use chance as a very valuable kind of mode towards finding form or actually finding a project also. Okay.
Yes,
and
yes,
we actively use that. Okay.
Yeah.
Whether I don't want. I mean, I'm okay with if you call it postmodern also. Actually, frankly speaking.
Yeah, but I don't think it's accurate.
I don't think it is accurate either. But if you want to call it postmodern, you call it postmodern. I'm okay with it. Okay.
Yeah.
But my ambition is very much modern in that sense.
Yeah.
The project itself is very much modern. Okay.
Yeah.
So I find that an interesting kind of a mix in which the studio gets played. Okay, with a lot of sort of techniques that bring about the ideas of the other in that sense. Because otherwise we're stuck with form follows function and
No. And we know that itself was like, even when the modernists were saying form follows function, and that statement was by Louis Sullivan, the way that he imagined function was not the way we have assumed it. We have assumed it to function in a very dumb way, that it is about the size of somebody. That's what we imagine it to. Well, actually, the way that Sullivan imagined what function was, he imagined it as a typological question. That the office type had a certain logic, and it wasn't that logic that he imagined function. He didn't imagine it to be like this sort of. So he was imagining typological ideas. What happened is that, I mean, I don't know. Actually, maybe we are not doing it. We are not doing. We are not doing this now for them. The new objectivity. We are not doing. We didn't do the Germans at all for them. So I think that there has been a legacy from Germany that has been very much part of a particular kind of Bauhausian imagination of what is function, that has led to the way that we imagined what function is, and that is what colleges like LSR, JJ continue to follow. It's how I was trained, Ishan. I studied at LSR, College of Architecture. It was a very particular way in which I was trained in terms of what is good architecture. There was a certain emphasis on efficiency, that you can't give a corridor that is more than 1.2 meters because you're wasting money. Understand? Well, actually, which is not really the truth, because you're making me into a machine that can only occupy a certain amount of time. You're turning the whole act of architecture only into an act of so-called efficiency, because not even really efficient. So, because it may be completely badly ventilated, for God's sake. So it's the truth is that the way that I was taught was a disaster. So when I am kind of very often putting together a course, and when we are doing this, very often I am personally rebelling against much of the shit that I was taught, because I know that it sucked. I think a lot of us are doing that, especially if you, especially when I started teaching at that point, which was, whenever, before you were born, my friend.
It's fascinating. Where do we put the school? You know, in that chart of evolution of architecture schools in India. If you are able to make like what Jenks is creating, if you are able to create that kind of a map almost, where do we put Kamaraja? Like I'm just thinking because I to a large extent I know where to put SEP. At least till when I was in school, I don't know now. Okay, but over here, and at the same time, I feel that that Kamaraja is has many forces at play. Okay, it is very difficult for me to think about it as a postmodern or a
the truth is this, like, let me, if I have to think about it now, I mean, because I did this, I was making a presentation to the school in Sao Paulo about this, about KRVI, and I laid KRVI down in the history of teaching, history of architectural teaching in India. And it is quite an important moment because it's 1992, right? Because the school begins.
yeah.
And 1992 is also the year when India's economy liberalizes dramatically. So what the school really is like it's a product of the liberalized era.
Yeah.
CEPT is pretty much a school of the modern Indian state and a certain imagination of a pan-national Indian. ये अपन इंडिया है, साथ साथ वो वर्नाक्युलर में इंडिया होता है, राजस्थान के कोर्टयार्ड्स और झरोखे में इंडिया होता है, ठीक है?
Rohan, it is built out of an idea of India which is constructed with institutional building. Okay.
Correct.
So with IIM, with NID, with everything like period of institutional building in India. Okay. So
when KRVI is kind of born, okay, the forces that have transformed the nation have already been critiqued. You have that the entire liberalization process was really a reaction against the old-fashioned bureaucratic nation state and its inability to deal with the city and deal with the complexities of the city. And it was imagined at that point that we need to kind of, for architecture to participate in the making of great places for people to live in, it needed to engage with the forces of the city, which actually was a uniquely KRVI, I think. That to deal with the dynamics of cities and questions of identity politics, very much part of the cities, the conflicts within cities, between classes, between genders, between castes, okay, not in the early years, not that clearly articulated. I think much more clearly articulated maybe in, I would say around the 2003, 2004, 2003, okay, is where it became much more apparent that the city then became the laboratory upon which we believed that the architecture could come up. And when we are saying the city, it wasn't only the physical fabric of the city, it was the dynamics of the city. So if to treat the slum as architecture, okay, was something that was seen as completely unusual and weird. I still remember going for thesis juries to other colleges or other jurors coming. उसमें क्या है, housing क्या कर रहे हो तुम लोग? Housing तो एक unit लेते हैं और वापस repeat करते हैं. उसमें architecture क्या है, right? And students have been failed because of things like that. So it took at that time, it took a lot of work to start for us to even think about the fact that architecture is actually something that emerges in dynamic forces and not something that is a static object that we can appreciate that represents Indianness in any. So I think that is really the place that KRVI started from. I think, and in that move, there's been lots of tension. Tension because that tension is going to be there. Any good school is going to have tensions, right? You have two tendencies that are very much at play. One that sees the craft of making buildings, as something that is the primary job of architects, and the other one sees the act of making great spaces, okay, as the job of the architect. Now, these are not necessarily the same thing, surprisingly. Okay, because the crafting of a building is connected to systems of production. Okay, the making of great space is not necessarily connected to those systems of production directly. The making of great space is concerned with ideas and value systems and economies that very often are constrained by the modes of production. So that tension that you have between, and that is endemic to architecture. Architecture has utopian imaginations, but cannot help but be produced by power. Whether that's governmental power, capitalist power, whoever it is, but it cannot help that because the bloody thing is expensive. And even if it's not expensive, it requires great political will. Which so finally, whether you like it or not, you're ending up you're turning out buildings or turning out your projects because of the connection with power. Na? So that tension jo hota hai na, Ishan, is a tension that is one of the fundamental characteristics of architecture around the world. And that tension very often plays itself out in many kind of complicated ways. You have people who reject the entire system. हमें नहीं करना है उनके साथ काम. Capitalist pigs. ठीक है. तो वो क्या करते हैं फिर barefoot architects बनकर यहाँ वहाँ घूमते हैं and then they work with their hands work with their hands with local builders. I know people who do that and they do amazing work. Okay, but I also know people who say that okay, fine, this is the way that the system works. Okay, but I want to be able to affect a lot of change. I want to participate in larger processes of transformation. And to do that, I know I'm going to have to work with bloody hell, irritating governments and irritating developers. But I'll try and do the best that I can within that framework. I will say that okay, these are the forces that are shaping it. It would be pointless for me to kind of imagine that I can affect change without dealing with them. I'll deal with them, but I will try and instill a value system in them. I will try and instill as much as I can a sense of freedom within them that I possibly can. It's a compromised position. Okay. Then there are other people who say that, damn, I don't want to kind of work as an architect at all because I think the modes of production of architecture themselves are fucked up. Are problematic. So they choose to say, I will think like an architect, but I'll do other things. I'll do graphic design, or I'll do politics, or I'll do sociology, or I'll become an activist, or whatever, right? So you have all these different modes of practice that people choose to have. So it depends on what choices you have, both as an individual, but also by the circumstances that are afforded to you, right? I mean, there are some people who come from poorer backgrounds, they are getting education, their families need the money. So there are circumstances that will automatically constrain what kind of practice they can do. You can't expect them to kind of have a practice of somebody who's privileged. So it's important to kind of keep ourselves a little more open. But there can be many practices that can emerge out of KRVI. So which is why as a school, coming back to the question you had, which is why as a school we believe that it is important to enable those choices and to provide the necessary skills for somebody to participate in the making of better spaces through the choices that that person makes. And those choices may be extremely kind of craft based, maybe extremely sort of activist based. All of these possibilities exist. We continue to be constrained by the fact that this is an architecture school that offers you a license to practice, which means we have to help you make buildings, show you that the buildings that you make cannot be broke, cannot fall down. Huh? You have a license to practice, which is why also it's in the making really that a lot of the concentration also happens. And I think that's a good thing. It's important to have these constraints because it really weighs yourself down into flights of fancy. It makes you really think about the concrete. And as any good lefty would want, the concrete is really where reality lies. It doesn't lie in abstract imaginations only. So I think the school, at least our school, continues to believe very much in the mapping of the concrete. The reason why the study trips are as elaborate as they are, whether that's the third year or the second year study trips, is that because we believe that it is to understand the concrete it's only through the understanding and the representation of the concrete that one can be able to understand what one should do. One should not work with an abstraction and a generalization that says that wo log aise hai, hum log aise hai, ye, but rather let's forget all of that. Let's just begin with looking at what is the ground. If you look at the ground and evolve an ideology through that, it'll be far more relevant to what we want to do. That's what the KRVI believes generally. Which is why this particular semester has been particularly difficult for us because the concrete doesn't exist. And that's been the tough thing. For us to develop courses, it's been difficult. I feel very bad that you guys aren't going on a study trip this time because I really feel that there's a lot you learn on a study trip that unfortunately is not going to happen this time. Let's see. Okay. Any other questions, guys? I spent a long time answering that one.
Ron, I have to leave.
Yeah, go. I'll hang around here for a while if they have any questions.
I'll shut down the recording. But
yeah, shut down the recording.